Now let's look at inputting numbers. So I'm going to go back to my input.py, and this time I'm going to write a function that inputs a floating point number. So let's call this function real, because it's returning a real value, input float, and it's going to take a prompt string as well. And what I want to do is basically declare input string is a string, and then ask the user to input that value. So display prompt and input string. And then somehow I want to be able to tell whether this input string is a valid floating point number. So I'm going to just write that in English in pseudocode, because the way you do that, it really depends on what language you're working in. Different languages have different ways of doing that. So rather than being too specific about how I would do it in Python, I'm just going to go ahead and write some English here. So if input string is a valid real number, then I'm going to return to real input string. And then I'm going to put this whole thing in a loop. So if I got here, I'm going to display, please enter a valid floating point number. And then this whole thing is going to be inside of a loop. So while true, do all of this. And then end while, and end function. So this is going to continue looping around until the user actually enters a valid real number, and then it's going to return the numeric value. So we can code this part pretty easily. And then I have a little problem here because I have to actually do my Python now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a helper function called isReal. So call it isValidReal, and I'm going to pass in input string, and then I'll define that later. And so if it is a valid real, then I'm going to return the float value of input string. Otherwise, if I get here, I'm going to print this piece of text, and then that's the end of my while loop and the end of my function. So now I have to declare or define isValidReal. And in Python, the best way of doing that is to use something called try except. So let me show you how that works, and then I'll explain it. So def isValidReal input string try So when I execute this line of code, it's either going to work and return the float value of input string and store it in float value, which means everything is okay, or it's going to cause an error. So if you try to type in something that isn't a number and you pass that into float, it's going to generate an error. And that's actually a value error. So let's try it without that just for a second, without the error catching, just to see what we get. So this is what I want to do, but this is going to cause an error. So let's go ahead and save that and go to our lesson 6, and I'm going to get rid of this code. And I'm just going to print input float. Please enter the number of years in programming. Like so. And if I run this code and I type a number like 40, it returns 40.0. But if I type something that isn't a number, I get an error. And the type of error I get is a value error. Could not convert string to float, pineapple. So this means that pineapple cannot be converted to a floating point number. And now in my input.py, I'm going to try to do that. But then if I get an error, I'll type value error, then I can do something else. So basically here, I'm going to return true because this is a valid floating point number. And if I get here, I'm going to return false because it's not a valid floating point number. So this function is going to return true if they typed a valid number and false otherwise. And then this code is going to say if they typed the valid number, return the number, otherwise loop through and try it again. So now let's try our function. So this time 40 still works, but if I type pineapple, it says please enter a valid floating point number. And it's going to continue doing that until I type a valid number. And 10.5 works fine. So now we have input validation on floating point numbers. And if we wanted to do integers as well, that's going to look basically the same here. So copy all of that and paste in a copy. Except this is going to return an integer, and I'll call it input int. And then all of this is the same, except if it's a valid integer, then return to integer input string. So please enter a valid whole number. And then this is valid real. I'm going to create is valid integer. And this is all the same, except it's an int val. And then int val is going to be the int of input string. And then input, I call it int or integer. Int is valid integer, then return the int value. Otherwise, please enter a valid whole number. So now I have input int as well. And if I change this to input int, it's going to give me, it's going to repeat the question until I enter a whole number. So let's try that. So now 40.0, that's not a valid whole number. and pineapple is not a valid whole number, but 6 is a valid whole number. Now, I could also do something for positive numbers, numbers greater than 0, numbers within a range, and so on. But those are going to depend on the particular kind of program that you're writing.